Ultimately, we're trying to drive some level of commonality across the aesthetic, the voice, the tone, the imagery. But there are nuances as you get into certain regions or markets, and what might be appropriate in one market needs to be judged or tweaked to drive within another.
Welcome to Behind the Numbers Brand Anatomy, an all-new eMarketer podcast that looks under the hood of your favorite brands, made possible by Mountain. It's March 9th, and I'm your host, Director of Insider Intelligence Marketing and Commerce Briefings, Jeremy Goldman. And this is the show that gets inside brands and dives deep into one of their recent campaigns or discusses the ROI behind a new technology they've adopted. Today, we're talking with Mike Janover, VP Global Digital and Direct Marketing at Gap Inc. Welcome, Mike.
Hey, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation, and here's what we have on deck for you today. First, a speed intro where we get to know our guest in 100 seconds or less. Then, tell me what you really think. We're yours truly and this week's guest discuss a few stories and themes in the news that'll be highly relevant to marketers. And then we jump into this week's case study, how Gap Inc. takes a portfolio approach towards investing in new marketing technologies. All right, Mike, time for your speed intro where we get to know you and see how you think on your feet. Our producer, Victoria, is going to be timing you. You ready?
Yeah, go for it. It's like the Budweiser hot seat.
More or less, actually. It's funny that you mentioned drinking, because we'll get to that. Your time starts now. First off, what's your core mission at Gap?
You know, I'm always thinking at a 10,000 foot level, how do we get as many mice into the mousetrap as possible, come and eat as much cheese as possible, and then tell all their mice friends about how great this place is and come back and eat more cheese. So it's all about how to drive acquisition, conversion, and retention.
Love it. If it was mandatory to be drinking a cocktail during this interview, what would you have?
You know, I'm a big tequila guy lately, and, no sugar. It's just straight tequila with maybe a tiny little dash of lime.
And speaking of sobering up afterwards, who's the number one business leader you'd want to have coffee with?
You know, I always like to sit down with Sonia, who's the CEO of Gap Inc., because there's a gazillion things we need to talk about all the time. So I enjoyed my conversations with her.
I think she's going to approve of that answer. Best talent of yours that has absolutely nothing to do with work.
Oh, gosh. I play basketball twice a week. And now that I'm sitting on Zoom calls all day long, I'm just getting injured all the time. So I guess my special skill is getting hurt.
What is your biggest pet peeve?
I got many. I'm a New Yorker originally. I guess one of my biggest pet peeves is when you're driving and someone cuts you off, but they don't use your blinker. You can use your blinker. That's okay. Just cut me off and use your blinker.
Fair enough. Favorite social network?
LinkedIn.
What do you consider to be your worst quality?
Attention span.
And two favorite news sources that aren't insider intelligence?
I like Media Post quite a bit. And there's some newsletter that I read called Charts. It's like CHRTZ or something like that. And it's storytelling all through like infographics, which I find really interesting.
Very cool. Now it's time for Tell Me What You Really Think. This is a new segment where I pick one or two stories in the news that'll be highly relevant to brand marketers and get our guests' perspective. So first off, wanted to ask you about this story that we published about how Walmart looks to be a destination for affordable fashion. They're making a push into elevated yet affordable fashion, unveiling the first collections from fashion designer Brandon Maxwell's Free Assembly and Scoop lines. They also launched Fielder, a new casual clothing line from Bonobos, which Walmart owns, that's aimed at 18 to 34-year-olds. So first off, curious, as a fashion insider, what are your thoughts about the whole movement towards affordable fashion and how to get it in front of as many people as possible?
Having spent my career in a variety of different roles, both marketing and e-commerce, the role that I played actually before Gap Inc. was working in ModCloth, which was acquired by Walmart and Walmart e-commerce. So Bonobos was a sister brand within the portfolio. So I think I watch what Walmart's doing really closely. Their competitive advantage vis-a-vis Amazon and others is just their retail footprint and truly that omnipresence. I think they have something like a Walmart store within 10 miles that hits like 90+% of the US population. So they have the scale and the supply chain that truly will enable them to leverage price points that are going to be very difficult for other players in the space to match. And so they will be formative, and they will be able to leverage their omni-channel distribution to be able to do that and do it at scale.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to me because it seems like this is a thing that everybody always wants to do at one point or another. Like, I'm old enough to recall when Target adopted this playbook. I think it was like 2 decades ago, building relationships with Mizrahi and Zach Posen, Alexander McQueen. And it seems to me like it's an interesting thing for some of these brands, I feel like, to balance out from a brand equity standpoint. What do you stand for? And the more accessible you wind up becoming, does that change your brand in some way? Can you sell the high-end things that you used to be able to sell when you try to release a more affordable fashion line? So I don't know the answer to that, but what do you think about that from a brand equity perspective?
Well, anytime if you're, sitting on a brand side, you're always trying to figure out kind of what are my strategic assets and what are my strategic needs. And sometimes in apparel or fashion, you might do collaboration with either a designer or a celebrity that can bring cachet or bring some attributes to your brand that you might not hold. So you can see how a company like Walmart might want to partner and work with individuals in that space that they don't have as much credibility in. And then there's levels that are table stakes, whether it's around, for good or sustainability. Got to check all those boxes for a variety of different customers to be able to lean in and support that brand.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's such a changing fashion world. And actually, that brings me to another story that we covered recently that I thought you'd have a perspective on. The idea, we asked the question in an article, what's driving growth in online fashion resale? And I think there are a lot of different areas that are, of course, the pandemic to some extent, like when does that not come into play in terms of something that has moved some of this acceleration up? But, you mentioned corporate social good and sustainability, and it seems like those are other factors. I mean, is there anything else that I'm missing? And, what's your perspective on all this? Is this a trend or a fad?
Yeah, both. I think that obviously with coronavirus and supply chain issues, it really helped accelerate accessibility for new clothes that were hard to find and get through both in store or lack of being able to go to a store and online. I think longer term, though, particularly for younger demographics, the renter economy is a thing. And so whether it's subscription or rental or reuse, sustainability, these are things that are top of mind, particularly for younger consumers. So I don't see that going away.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think that there was one thing that we looked at in this particular article. It was a study from Civic Science in June 2021, and found that about half, 47% of people don't actually purchase used clothing at all, and they don't really have any interest in going in that direction. But 25% do, and they like it, and those numbers have shifted a lot. And you mentioned younger consumers. It seems to me that maybe values change in society, and then all of a sudden it becomes, thrifting and resale, secondhand goods just becomes part of the landscape. And, every single retailer has to get used to it. You don't have the ability, presumably, like in 5 years, maybe to not even play in this field. It just seems like it's going to be a must do.
Yeah, apparel is something like one of the largest employers of the world. Apparel is also one of the categories that pollutes the earth the most as well. And so the renter economy is a real thing, and different brands are experimenting in that space, but also extending the life of apparel and clothing. So lightly used or used clothing, even within the ecosystem and platforms of retailers, is becoming something that brands are experimenting in as well. And part of that is a quality messaging narrative, and part of that is reducing kind of environmental footprint and extending the life of clothing, which is also paramount for a lot of brands.
All right. Another thing that's paramount is taking a quick break. We're going to take a quick word from our sponsor, Mountain, and then we'll be right back.
If running TV ads were as easy as paid search and social, everyone would be doing it. That's where Mountain Performance TV comes in. It's the world's first and only connected TV software platform that makes television advertising as intuitive as the rest of your self-serve performance channels, with access to premium streaming networks and technology optimized to drive performance. You have a new way to drive website visits and conversions. Visit mountain.com to learn more.
All right, now it's time for our brief case study, where we look at a recent brand campaign or deployment and discuss what went right and some lessons for next time. So first off, Mike, I wanted to ask you, what are your primary responsibilities at Gap in a nutshell?
In a nutshell, I'd probably say there's maybe 6 primary areas, and it's kind of a potpourri a little bit. There's a component around ad operations. So how do we maximize the performance of our advertising through audience selection and segmentation to the product feeds? We're powering things like PLAs and DPAs and performance-based media. A lot around audience and media enablement, driving standardized taxonomy and case studies and audience selection across our stack. A lot of process and alignment and best practices. So I run, and my team runs, best practices and steercos around media effectiveness, CRM, SEO, training and playbooks across the teams within the portfolio. A lot of work around compliance and risk management. So that's things like, how do we deal with e-privacy and lost data signals from things like iOS 14.5? How do we prepare for a cookieless world? A lot of work around media effectiveness at an omni-channel and full funnel media perspective. And then a lot of work in partnership with our media agencies and our tech stack vendors.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there and a lot of different directions that we can go with that. I think one thing that we had talked about off air is how you're tackling personalization at scale, which I think is a very interesting topic and top of mind for a lot of our listeners. So how are you doing it?
Oh man, this could be like a whole podcast and then some, but I'd say at its core, personalization at Gap Inc. is really attempting to improve the relevance of content, of products, offers, and really recommendations we put in front of customers. And we try to do that in a way that, 1, isn't creepy, 2, is compliant with consumer protection and best practices. But ultimately, as a North Star, it's meant to improve the customer experience. Yeah, and this is supported by a set of integrated capabilities for really a wide range of strategies, whether it's around sales growth or margin expansion or cross-channel brand shopping, or really customer retention and lifetime value. But it's more than just a tech stack. It really is a mindset and an approach and how we structure teams and process and measurement. So a good example of that is we've stacked up these agile pods within the portfolio and within the brands. And it's just kind of taking a playbook, if you call it, from Silicon Valley of sprints and scrums and the agile methodology, but how do we drive a test and learn agenda within the brands at a customer and at a channel level to drive business performance? But at a 10,000 foot level, we tackle it in a variety of different dimensions. So one's going to be around identity. How can we best recognize a customer and as close to real time as possible as we can? A second level will be around decisioning. So where we can identify the best next action for that customer. Third is around content. So how do we surface the right offer or the right message? And then around deliverability, particularly in how we've opted into some of our earn and own channels, and how do we orchestrate that messaging across channels? And oh, by the way, we do it at scale. And so I know, Jeremy, you asked me for always stats and figures, which I know the listeners might enjoy. So I got a few. So just around scale, we've got over 50 million members in our integrated loyalty program. We surface over 1,800 products that are showcased within our programmatic advertising units. We send about 50 billion emails annually, and that's with a B. Right now, simultaneously, we're firing about 130 active trigger lifecycle marketing campaigns, particularly in email, app, SMS push, just to give you an idea of the size and scale which we're talking about.
Yeah, obviously, I think that we know that it's a really significant portfolio. So I understand that you're introducing a new suite of tools around paid, earned, and owned channels. And without getting into vendors, what were some of the top problems you were looking to solve when introducing that suite? And how did you speak to all stakeholders to figure out like what were the top places that you ought to solve for?
I mean, this can go and touch your ad tech stack, your MarTech stack, your e-commerce. This could be a retail store, but I think there's some themes there. One of them be around identity. So, and the various user states that we have in our customers, ranging from completely known to recognized or even authenticated. Basically, people are authenticating, logging in, if you will, and with their loyalty program. Consumer protection and compliance is a thing. And as we know, there's ever-changing rules and regulations that are happening at a state, federal, and even country level. And there's always a natural friction in trying to drive some consistent brand voice and narrative while we try to leverage that tech stack and personalization to enable kind of really AI and machine learning to kick in to maximize business performance. So it's always this kind of give and take and work we have to do in partnership with the brands and the marketing leads there. And we got to make sure that there's a stack that's flexible enough to experiment and an infrastructure to execute on measurement and really understand the incrementality. So there's a lot of dimensions tied toward that. And like everything, it's always a three-legged stool: people, process, and tech. You can have the best tech stack in the world, but if you don't have the right people and skill set and the right process stacked up against that, and particularly around change management, if you're changing kind of ways of working, which we are in a significant way, it's not going to work. And so there's a lot of working teams, training, steercos, shared best practices, you name it, across the board related to that.
And it's fine, by the way, if there's no differences from a brand to brand perspective. But I always find it really interesting when we've got somebody like you that we can talk to who's working across brands. And I know you have like deep experience, for instance, with Banana Republic from some of your past roles. But what are some of the nuances in each of your portfolio brands and their users, how consumers react to different technologies? Do you see like one brand doing better on SMS, for instance, one on push, and anything like that?
Yeah. So in case not everyone's aware, there's 4 major brands within Gap Inc. There's Old Navy, Athleta, Banana Republic, and Gap. And they're here domestically, they're abroad. Each one of those brands have nuances to their assortment, to their pricing architecture, their product aesthetic, and even the demo and age and just overall psychographics, demographics, all the graphics you can think of. And so there are definitely nuances across that portfolio. We commonly see some different adoption rates and levels of success when we're launching new technologies or capabilities, but there are definitely nuances. And a lot of times it's also reliant on how well the brands can catch this. What else did they have going on in their roadmaps or initiatives that they're trying to launch? And so a lot of times we're doing proof of concept, maybe with one brand within the portfolio. If successful, we'll then test it in another. And that's how we try to increase and maximize the flywheel of innovation and speed. So I'm kind of putting my fingers in quotes right now. We talk about power of the portfolio all the time, and that's a good example of that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know that you've got the brands, but then you just touched upon another important thing, which is the localities. And, it gets me thinking about how people in different regions actually react to different technologies. And, I know from covering this on a day-to-day basis, the answer is, the region, the market really does matter. So what are your primary markets that you're serving, and what differences have you seen in terms of how people are responding to various tech? From a market to market basis, or maybe just some highlights?
Yeah. So our primary market is really North America, but we are global in nature. So US, Canada, but we've got wholly owned and operated functions in both Japan and China. And then we've got a pretty extensive franchise partnership ecosystem through Europe, Middle East, et cetera. There are definitely nuances associated to it. So a good example is in Pac Rim, just watching what's happening within live shopping and how that's getting intertwined into the customer journey experience. It's not an if, it's a when that will start to get additional traction and speed in the Western regions and kind of the US or North America. So a lot of things that are happening in adoption, as you can imagine, things in mobile, everything's already kind of, the scale is tipped, everything is mobile already, but the extent of that in, I call it, Asia is double associated to that. So when you run programs through SMS or push or things like live streaming, et cetera, that adoption and that curve is much more significant over in Pac Rim.
How important is it for you to maintain brand consistency in global markets? I mean, I know that was kind of my life at one point, going back like almost a decade, and it was difficult. And certain markets just felt very strongly about certain things. So is that difficult at all from a brand consistency standpoint, or just Gap Inc.? Is that like a high priority, would you say?
It really is. If you're these brands at the end of the day are lifestyle brands, and there's deep ethos and cause marketing and a vibe associated to it. Ultimately, we're trying to drive some level of commonality across the aesthetic, the voice, the tone, the imagery. But there are nuances as you get into certain regions or markets, and what might be appropriate in one market needs to be judged or tweaked to drive within another. So yes, there are things like style guides and brand guidelines and voice and tone and some elements of oversight, but there's enough latitude to make some tweaks on a regional basis to make it relevant for the consumers that are in that market, because what will work in one region will not always work in another.
And speaking of that, I wanted to ask you, what are the top 3 technologies that you're actively implementing or in discussions to implement at the moment? And then maybe we'll get to some things that you're looking at for down the line after that.
Oh, man, there's multitudes of ones across the organization, but 3
That's why I wanted to force you to, because it's tough. I know there's so many different aspects, I imagine, right?
But just within my swim lane and kind of ecosystem, 3 that are kind of hot, top of mind for us. Some of them we've already had, but we're continuing to really further optimize. One, for the lack of a better term, is kind of a customer data platform or a CDP. And that's really paramount for how we drive personalization at scale. Also, side where we're working to try to evaluate our affiliate agency of record and our tech platform, totally separate, but somewhat interrelated. And also the third, I think, would be around a new MMP, a mobile media, our measurement partner, and how we drive really our app growth strategies.
And there's obviously, I know it's tough to pick the 3, but then again, I'm kind of letting you pick 6 because I'm wondering, how about things that you're actively following at the moment that aren't necessarily at the implementation stage? Because I know that there are a lot of things that you just kind of talk about. They're written about a lot in trade publications. They might not be ready for prime time yet, but what are some things that you're actively following?
I'm watching the live shopping space really closely. There's been a lot of experimentation, obviously in the Pac Rim, but also here in the States across the portfolio of brands. They've been kind of one-off solutions, but I'm really interested in understanding a little bit more about the kind of SaaS enterprise platform that allow you to kind of measure twice, cut once, and then publish, not just within kind of, let's say, your social platforms, but also on your app and on your website, and just that end-to-end production experience to allow that to scale. So that's one. The second would be leaning in on, I'm putting my fingers in quotes again, around kind of a media intelligence engine. So, we've got media running all over the place, in traditional media, digital media, across the 4 brands, across earned and owned channels. Our ability to aggregate spend data plus performance KPIs and get a really good read and understanding, not only for media performance, but also like finance and reconciliation, and add a level of AI and machine learning for recommendations and understanding anomalies of what we're seeing. Again, it's just how we capitalize on that power of the portfolio and drive speed in our media insight and also our optimizations. And the other one that's kind of just for me personally, I'm trying to learn a little bit more about reputation management. And there's so many ways you can think about that. But the specific one that I'm thinking about is how you monitor and respond to both paid social comments and then the workflow, depending on the comments that are coming in. How do we channel that to a store manager versus a merchant versus someone in customer care, as well as in environments like Google Business or Yelp, comments that come in there, and then how do we properly respond to those in a timely manner?
So this is an audio podcast, so nobody's going to be able to really see this, but you got a lot of books behind you. Where do you find the time to read any of them, given everything that's on your plate?
That was before I was in this role where I had time to read. So it's just all an illusion of that I do have time. No, honestly, I'm reading probably more trades and newsletters than I am fiction these days, but we all dream.
Well, it's great from an aspirational standpoint. I want to ask you the parting shot question that we'd like to ask everybody. What are 2 brands that you particularly admire that you draw inspiration from and know they cannot be Gap Inc. brands?
I never thought I would be one, but I've turned into a little bit of a car geek. And so I kind of pick your poison, but I love the model of car brands where they have kind of this parent ethos, higher level aesthetic, and then how that cascades down to dealerships or more local advertising, and the intersection and alignment of those two, I think is fascinating. So I love BMW, and I love watching kind of how they go to market. And I'd say the other one that I'm watching really closely is what's happening in cryptocurrency. I think what Coinbase is doing is interesting. I made a point over the holidays, whether we talk about blockchain or we talk about NFTs or we talk about cryptocurrency, you have to be knowledgeable of what's happening in this space. And so I've been kind of tracking some brands in that area as well, not just from a marketing perspective, but also as a marketer, understanding what the future is going to hold. We talk about the metaverse later, but it's all interrelated. So being knowledgeable in that space is incredibly important as well.
Well, that's fantastic. A lot of food for thought there. Mike, this was really fantastic.
My pleasure, and always great to catch up with you, Jeremy.
And that's all the time we have for today's episode. Let us know what you think, though. We'd love to hear from you at podcast@emarketer.com. I'll be back in 2 weeks for another episode of the Behind the Numbers Brand Anatomy. Make sure to tune in tomorrow for the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by Mountain.